My name is Mitch Holland, and I have been in the field of forensic science for 30 years. And probably sort of, you guys are all students, you're attending this and you're sort of seeing what this is all about. And it may sound kind of hokey and it's not really for me, or we may talk for a bit and you might say, wow, this is really what I want to do. And that's kind of what happened to me. I went to a conference 30 years ago, a little over 30 years ago, and they were talking about applying molecular biology related tools, things like sequencing DNA and making copies of DNA with PCR, and applying that to solve forensic investigations. And for me, it just was the light bulb that went on, and I said, that's what I want to do. And so for 15 years, I ran forensic DNA labs. For about 10 years for the military, the United States military. There's a pretty big effort there to identify individuals killed in military conflicts, and also individuals who commit crimes. And then for about 5 years in the private sector, serving individuals and clients all around the world who had interests in doing forensic DNA analysis. And then I came to Penn State University about 15 years ago and helped start a forensic science program here. And I've been here ever since. So I teach and I do research and service work. I still remain active in the community. In fact, I'm an acting lab director for a small private forensic DNA company here in State College, Pennsylvania, where Penn State is located. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the field. I have knowledge of other disciplines, so I'm not just a forensic DNA guy, but that's what I do mostly. So I'll just, if that's all right, Ralph, just open up the.
Yeah, that would be great. And some of them I'll read their questions, and some of them I'll let them ask their questions. So some of the students want to know: were you always interested in molecular biology? How did you get into that?
That's a great question. You have to be a scientist first. Right? You have to be interested in science. And so I have a bachelor's degree or an undergraduate degree in chemistry. I have a PhD in biochemistry. And then I did postdoctoral work in genetics or human biology. So I moved to human systems. And it was at that time that I stumbled upon the application of what I was learning to solve crime. And it just was the right fit for me. And with a PhD, you're able to go up higher in the ladder. And so I was able to become a laboratory director, and I was a director of sorts for about 20 years during my career. But science is first, right? You got to be a scientist.
Certainly. We have a few questions from Ms. Delgado's class down in Florida. And Ms. Delgado, you guys should be able to unmute if you want your kids to ask their questions. If not, I can read them. There you go.
My question is, have you always had a passion for forensic science?
I didn't quite catch the question.
They wanted to know, have you always had a passion for forensic science?
Well, that's a great question. And I think it's an answer with more depth perhaps than just a yes/no answer. And it really kind of starts with who you are and what motivates you. And I love solving things. I'm a person who likes to arrange and to maximize and to do things that build things. And so for me, I was really interested in the solving aspect. I was interested in the building aspect, because when I came into forensic DNA was a very young field. It's really only since the late 1980s that forensic DNA really emerged as an application in forensic science. So I was able to start at the beginning and help the field develop all the methodologies and sort of build forensic science. And then I came to Penn State, and I'm teaching now. And that is another thing that I'm very passionate about, is teaching and relating my experiences and my knowledge to others, and putting them on a path that perhaps will make them successful in the field. So I am passionate about forensic science, but I'm really mostly passionate about learning and teaching forensic science.
And we thank you for helping educate and inspire students today. We have a question from Natalia, and Natalia, you should be able to unmute to ask your question.
I wanted to know, what do you see on a daily basis, like as a forensic scientist?
Well, it's a great question, and it's a tough question to answer because it's not a fun situation sometimes. You get really awful things that come to you in the lab that you have to work on. Samples that you would never think you would have to be faced with in crimes that you never thought you'd have to be exposed to. So you have to be a person that can handle that aspect of things. And it's difficult because, crimes against children, crimes against anybody really, right, are difficult to deal with. And one example, we helped to identify victims of the World Trade Center attacks back in 2001. And so there were thousands of individuals killed, and there were tens of thousands of samples of biological material collected from the scene where the World Trade Center towers collapsed. So, we were all, of course, affected by the attack itself emotionally, and then we had to work on remains of individuals who were killed. And so you have to understand that there's a lot of importance tied to that, because you're helping to identify people and bring them back to their loved ones so that they can bury those remains. Or you're helping to solve a case where you're getting a bad individual off the streets so that they can't commit more crimes. That's a really important thing, right? You forget that if you've found someone or helped to find someone guilty of a crime and they spend time in jail, they're not out on the streets potentially victimizing other people. So there are individuals who would have never known they were going to be victims, who would have been victims if you hadn't solved that crime. So it's a really important job.
Very much so, and you guys are almost like modern day superheroes. We've had many 9/11 survivors from the Trade Center, and we thank you for your incredible work with that, identifying victims. We have another question from Ms. Delgado's class down in Florida, and you can go ahead and ask your question, Ms. Delgado.
What does a day in your life look like?
What does a day in your life look like?
As a forensic scientist?
Yes.
So if you're a forensic scientist, it's a good question, right? A day in your life is unpredictable. What's going to come through the door next? And I teach my students that all the time. In fact, my students are right now in the process of doing a mock case where we've set up samples that look like forensic case samples. They receive them like they're samples. They work with an investigator as if they're working with somebody on a case. And you just don't know what's going to come through the door. And sometimes that's exciting because, what's going to come next. But it's, again, it can be a little daunting in terms of what might come next. So it's very unpredictable. There's always routine aspects of every job. So you'll have certain things that are the same. But forensic scientists tend to have quite a bit of variation in their daily life in terms of what they see and how they're interacting with people and the nature of any case that comes through the door.
That's a good answer. We have we'll go with a few more questions. We don't want to take too much of your time, but we have Michaela in Italy, and she had a pretty good question. You should be able to ask.
Thank you. I want to ask, if you could go back, would you change your job? Why or why not?
I would not have changed anything in my entire career.
Why?
I have enjoyed all aspects. Working in a government organization has different characteristics. Working in the private sector has different characteristics, and working in an academic environment has different characteristics. So I've been able to experience different ways of doing many of the same things, and I wouldn't have traded any of the experiences. I've been very fortunate in my career to have worked on some really interesting cases. So, that's all you can ask for, right?
Absolutely. And it sounds like you would, if someone was passionate about criminal forensics or microbiology, that you would recommend such a career, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'd also recommend getting as high a degree as you want to get, right? If you obtain a PhD or a doctoral degree, then there are more doors that will open for you down the road. If you're content with working in the lab and that's all you want to do, then that's great. You can spend an entire career just working in the lab, and there are plenty of people I know who do that and have been happy for decades doing that. So, but again, it's not for everyone. You could think of it maybe as a surgeon, right? Being a surgeon and getting in there and cutting people open and doing things inside a body is not for everyone. Not everybody can handle that. So forensic science is sort of the same thing. You have to be able to deal with situations that are difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I know that Ms. Delgado's class down in Florida, you guys were learning about gel electrophoresis, and we're going to connect for a future edutainment. Thankfully, Dr. Holland is interested in teaching you guys a little bit about that, but we'll have one in the near future regarding that. We'll just go with a couple more questions, then we'll let you go. But I have Giovanni in Italy, and Giovanni had a pretty good question, so you should be able to unmute and ask.
How do the technology help your work, please?
So I'm not sure if you got that. He wants to know, how do you deal with, how do criminal forensics use technology in their careers?
Yeah, good question. And actually right now there's a huge movement of change in technology in forensic DNA or forensic molecular biology. And I don't know if you've heard about massively parallel sequencing. Massively parallel sequencing. If you haven't heard about it, go out and learn about it. It's the absolute future. It's going to mean you'll walk into a doctor's office and be able to have things diagnosed in a way you will never have them diagnosed in the past. You'll be able to send a case to a forensic lab and do things that could never have been done in the past. It's moved technology forward at just lightning speed compared to sort of normal progression in technology. So learn about that. And we could always talk about that at some point down the road too. Massively parallel sequencing doesn't matter what you do in DNA, you're going to do massively parallel sequencing.
That sounds interesting, and it's along those lines that we have a question from Dragana. Dragana, you should be able to unmute. And I was actually kind of wondering this myself. So let's see. All right, I don't know if they can unmute, but they wanted to know, is criminal forensics? Oh, there you go. Go ahead and ask.
I just wanted to know, is the work of science forensics, as we see in the movie, I mean, do you really examine the body in the crime scene?
Is it like what we see in the movies and in TV
Right.
shows and CSI and all that?
Right. It's rarely exactly like it is in the shows. As you can see, I'm not wearing any sort of fancy clothing, and I don't have any cool lighting coming down. Right. We're just regular people doing the work. But the other question embedded in that was, do you do everything? Do you work the scene and do the laboratory work and do other things like the medical examiner work? Typically not, but in some cases, the individuals who work at an agency will go to a scene and help with scene investigation. They'll do work in the lab. It might assist the medical examiner in doing some things. It all depends upon the agency. Some agencies are, you just do laboratory work or you just do crime scene work. As a forensic scientist, you're always going to go to court, right? You always have to take the information that you've generated in the laboratory and bring it to court and give it to the people who are going to make decisions about guilt and innocence in a case.
Well, Dr. Holland, we'll first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to so many students around the world about your career and criminal forensics and microbiology and everything that you do. Before we let you go, is there any advice that you could give to these kids, whether they want to go into criminal forensics, whether they want to follow in your career path or do something completely different? What kind of advice would you give to them as they go out in the world and figure out what they want to do?
Yeah, this is the time for you to explore. Right? This is the time for you to think about things that you might be interested in and evaluate whether or not it really is something you want to do. So attending things like this, so you just get pieces of information, will help you make decisions down the road. But this is really a gathering process and an exploring process for you. And it can continue into your undergraduate work. before you have to make perhaps any final decisions about which direction you're going. And even in my career, I worked for the military, I worked for a private company, and I worked for an academic institution. So even though you're doing the same basic thing, those are three really distinctly different entities. So you can always navigate and drift to other things. Don't think that because you've made a decision, it means you can't change directions as you move down the road. So be flexible, gather. Gather is really important. Be a sponge.